Christos anesti. Christ is risen. Christos voskresi, amasikam. Christos resucitado. Your friendly neighborhood Monomach was here speaking to you from an undisclosed location. Today I would like to take the time to address a burning issue that is in the body politic and has to do with our Commonwealth. And I'm speaking specifically about the Electoral College and measures to abolish it or to go around it. There are several states who are trying to bundle their votes, and even though if the majority of the people of the state of, say, Colorado vote for candidate X, but candidate Y wins the majority vote overall, then they're going to bundle their votes and give the separate slate of electors to candidate Y. This is a very dangerous, stupid, and evil idea. First of all, the whole purpose of an electoral college is to honor the votes of the states. If the people of the state of Colorado or Oklahoma or Vermont vote for the loser, and they're the only state that vote for the loser, that doesn't matter. When a Vermonter or an Oklahoman or a Coloradoan pulls the lever for candidate X, and the majority of the people in that state go for candidate X, the electors are duty bound by an almost sacred oath to deliver those votes to honor the wishes of the voters in their state. Okay, that is anything less than that will ultimately lead to chaos and tyranny. Trust me on this, and I'll explain why. But first of all, I want to dispense with this ridiculous notion that all votes should be equal, and that's why the majority of the voters in the 50 states, whoever they vote for the majority, should win the presidential and vice presidential election. On paper, that sounds right, but we are not a nation. We are a nation, but we are a conglomeration of 50 so far sovereign states. Excuse me. The states preceded the Constitution. That's why until the war between the states, it was an open question whether secession was available to the people or to the states, whether it was legal. Even after the war between the states, the Supreme Court would never really want to address it if it came up before it, because the idea that the state was sovereign was sacrosanct to the people. Having said that, the war between the states put an end to that. Regardless, we are all still states. And the federal Constitution not only divides power among three co-equal branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judiciary, but between the federal government and the states. Okay? And the reason for this, and this is the point of this conversation, is because power is best diffused among several different peoples and or groups of people. Okay, let's just get right to it. The jury system, 12 men tried and true, according to the old cliche. Well, why do you have a jury? Because it's very hard to fool 12 people. It's very hard, not impossible, but well nigh improbable for 12 people to come to a wrong conclusion. And there's any number of reasons for that, not just the mathematical impossibilities of it, but because things like there's peer pressure and or consensus. Even in the Bible it says the testimony of two men is tried and true. Okay? You don't send a man to the gas chamber on the testimony of one man. It's got to be on two men. In the Constitution it says treason shall be adjudged because of the testimony of two witnesses. It stands to reason that if you need two people to adjudicate or to make an accusation and make it stick, if you have 3, 4, and 5, and 6, and more people, it makes it very hard to conspire, collude, or otherwise prevaricate a person into into a guilty verdict. It's hard, very hard. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened, but think about it. I mean, in the 240 years of our republic, there have been tens of thousands of jury trials. Okay, how many were adjudicated to? How many in the past have we looked back and said, well, they were probably wrong? One of the classic critiques against the death penalty is that there have been probably 23 wrongful convictions which ended in execution. Well, one is too many, but 23 out of a million is infinitesimal. And in our fallen world, all you can do is look at the broad view of things, okay? And what works best most of the time for most of the people is what we're talking about here, okay? Hence, elections. Now, before we talk about the Electoral College, we'll talk about, and I've led up to it, the principle. We are not a democracy, we are a republic. I'll talk about the differences shortly. The idea of whether you're talking about a democracy or a republic is to diffuse power among as broad a spectrum of people as possible, as I've already said. Excuse me. Well, this is a good thing because it makes the chance of error less likely. Okay? Now, that's why we have votes. Okay. Now, before I go into exactly what we're talking about here, a word must be said about democracy and why we are not a democracy. I'm going to split the difference here. The Greek word democracy, demos kratos, means the people rule. Unfortunately, when the Greeks came up with the idea of democracy, it wasn't the people ruling, but only certain qualified electors ruling, or at least having the ability to cast a vote or sit on a jury. In any ancient Greek politia, or polity, a city-state, there may be 20% of the actual inhabitants of that city were citizens and could vote. We were only talking about freeborn men. And usually they had to serve in the army. And usually they couldn't be public charges. They couldn't be beggars, for instance. Who couldn't vote? Well, women, okay, that's half the population right there. Children, of course, resident aliens, illegal aliens, homosexuals. Believe it or not, yes, homosexuals, especially if they were passive, could not vote. They could even be drummed out of the city, especially if they were of a high-ranking state. Okay? So, we've got to be very careful when we say the word democracy. It doesn't mean what we mean today here in America, in which every Tom, Dick, and Harry, whether he's on welfare or whether he's a bum or a wino or a derelict or physically incapacitated or mentally incapacitated, can vote. And now if Bernie Sanders and occasional cortex get their way, even thieves, murderers, rapists, and terrorists in prison. Okay, that's not a democracy. Okay. And, as I said, we are a republic. Now that comes from two Latin words, res publica, the thing of the people. Kind of like democracy, congruent, all right? But it means the thing of the people. And what is the thing of the people? That is the law. Alrighty, so, the Electoral College. Why do we have an Electoral College? Because it was never about one man, one vote, as I've explained. why it could never be one man, one vote. Because let's be honest, not all votes are equal, are they? Not really. Really. It's not that the vote of an Oklahoman is worthy more than that of a Californian, because Oklahoma only has 7 electoral votes, California has 53, I believe. And you could say, well, gosh, that's unfair, because Californians at least should be equal to Oklahomans. Well, let's just deal with this on the federal level. Why I'm going to prove to you why all votes are not created equal. Well, first of all, there's 330 million people in the United States, but only 535 of them are tasked to enact legislation. 535 votes are what's needed. Among those 535, a majority, in some cases a supermajority, is needed to create a law. Let's go through it. There's 435 in the House of Representatives, 100 in the Senate. Okay, so 435, that means that 218 in the House can vote to pass a law, a simple bare majority, 50% plus 1. That's fine and dandy. Unfortunately, it's useless unless the Senate takes it up. If the Senate takes it up, then it's got a chance. If it doesn't matter if 435 people in the House vote for a law. If the Senate doesn't take it up, those 100 votes overrule the 435. But let's say the Senate takes it up. Well, 60 have to break a filibuster. 60 votes have to bring it to cloture, or invoke cloture, which means no more discussion, now we're going to vote. At that point, a bare majority, 51, is needed to pass the law. If it's 50-50 tie, then the vice president breaks the tie, and if he doesn't, then I suppose the law doesn't pass. So all of a sudden we see a massive inequality in votes here, don't we? Between the people who elect the congressman and the senators. There's all these massive roadblocks, which means that makes the vote in its general abstract principle unequal. And it has to be that way. We've decided that. It's in the Constitution because we're a republic. But let's say now that this bill, which we'll call it the Mom and Apple Pie Bill, passes the House and the Senate. Well, the president, his vote is necessary now because he'll pick up his pen and he'll say yes, and then he'll hand it to the registrar and it'll go into the U.S. code and it's a law. Or he can pick up another pen and say no and overrule it. Veto, which means, it's an ancient Latin word which means I forbid. Okay, that was the right of the tribune in the ancient Roman Republic. It was called the tribunician potestas. Veto, I forbid. A tribune could forbid the execution of a plebeian. Okay, so even if he was guilty, he could forbid it. Okay, so the president in the United States has the power of the tribunician potestas. He can say, I forbid it. Now, that's not the end of it. It can go back to the House and the Senate, and they can override it. It needs a supermajority, though. So at that point, 1/3 plus 1 of the House and 1/3 plus 1 of the Senate, in other words, 34 senators, have an even more powerful vote because they can stop the House and or the Senate from overriding the president's veto. Okay, so now we go to the Supreme Court, or the judiciary. The Supreme Court has the right, 9 men and women now, to uphold a law if it's brought before them, or of a judicial case which brought before them a civil case by a simple majority. Okay, and since our court system has now devolved into conservative justices and liberal justices with, we don't know who's in the middle, then that one person traditionally for about 30 years has been Justice Anthony Kennedy. Even though he was conservative, he was only about 60% would rule with conservatives at the time. He had tremendous power. In fact, his vote was probably the most powerful vote in the nation during the last 3 decades because everybody looked to him. How would Justice Kennedy vote? Regardless, that is a vote that further underscores the ability of what we're talking about here of the vote not being equal. Alrighty? So, whenever somebody says to you, well, we got to get rid of the Electoral College because it's got to be one man, one vote, and all votes are equal. All votes are never equal. They can't be. Because if they are, and if we are reduced to a majoritarian democracy, which will ultimately turn into a mobocracy, then constitutional law will go down the toilet, and we will eventually be faced with complete anarchy, complete civilizational breakdown, which always, always, always leads to tyranny. So, I've now educated you all. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video log, and I hope that you have been enlightened, and let's try to love one another. Pax vobiscum. Adios.